In this video, we are going to learn about an important man in American history, George Washington. George Washington was a military general and led the American colonists to victory in the American Revolution. He was a founding father of the United States, meaning he was one of the people who started the United States of America. And he served as the first president of the United States, the very first president of the United States. Let's look at his life to see how George Washington helped start the United States of America. It starts in 1732. Wow, that was a long time ago. George Washington was born in the colony of Virginia in 1732. Now, when George Washington was born, the colony of Virginia was part of Great Britain. In fact, all of the American colonies were part of Great Britain. This is what the British flag looked like during George Washington's lifetime. It looked pretty similar to what it looks like today. The colony of Virginia, the place where George Washington grew up, belonged to Great Britain. Now, a lot of people have wondered what George Washington was like as a kid, right? But George Washington didn't share many details about his childhood. There is a popular legend about George Washington when he was 6 years old. It's an interesting one. The legend says that George Washington received an axe for his birthday and used it on one of his dad's cherry trees. Uh-oh! That's a weird gift to get for your 6th birthday. When his dad found out that his cherry tree was damaged by young George, George was brave and told his dad the truth, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." This legend is one of the most famous legends in American history. The legend was written by this guy, a man named Parson Weems. That's an interesting name. He was the first person to write a biography on George Washington after he died. Most historians believe this story was made up by Parson Weems. Even though it was made up, it is a legend that many people think of when they think of George Washington. One thing we know for sure about George's childhood is that his dad died when George was just 11 years old. After his dad died, George spent some time living with his half-brother named Lawrence at a place called Mount Vernon, the plantation owned by Lawrence. Living with his half-brother Lawrence, George was able to learn how to survey land. To survey land is to figure out the distance between different parts of a piece of land, usually to figure out how big a piece of land is. Someone who surveys land is called a land surveyor. In order to be a land surveyor, you have to know a lot of math. George Washington had to use his math skills to survey land. As he got older, people paid him to survey their land, and he had to use math skills every time he did it. This is pretty cool. Here is a picture of a land survey done by George Washington himself. Oh my goodness, he had fancy handwriting. This is so sad. He may have continued working as a surveyor if it weren't for another tragedy in his life. 9 years after his dad died, George's half-brother Lawrence got sick and died too. George was 20 years old when Lawrence died. 2 years later, when George was just 22 years old, he became the full owner of Mount Vernon. Now, we didn't mention this earlier, but Lawrence had been a military general for the British in the Virginia militia. Remember, the colony of Virginia, like the other American colonies, belonged to Great Britain. George decided to follow in his footsteps and became a major in the Virginia militia. This was a big deal, especially for someone as young as George was. And it didn't take long for George Washington to be put to the test. The governor of Virginia sent George Washington on a special mission to tell the French to leave an area called the Ohio Valley. They didn't like that, and they made it clear they would not leave the Ohio Valley, and 1 year later, George Washington led hundreds of soldiers in an event that would start the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War made George Washington famous. He wrote about his experiences and became well known, not just in the colonies, but also across the Atlantic Ocean in Great Britain. The French and Indian War not only made George Washington famous, but it also gave him military experience that he would later need during the American Revolution. After the war, George was not offered a placement in the regular British Army, which must have been so frustrating after all he did, and he returned to his plantation, remember, called Mount Vernon. He got married to a lady named Martha and started a family at Mount Vernon. So he settled down, and that might have been the end of his story, but he also got involved in politics, which would put him at the right place at the right time. After years of being a politician in Virginia, in 1774, George Washington was chosen to be a delegate of Virginia in the First Continental Congress. A delegate is someone who is sent to represent other people. Virginia trusted George Washington to represent their interests. It was really cool. George Washington was frustrated with how the colonies were being treated by Great Britain, just like so many other colonists. Many of their rights were taken away by laws called the Intolerable Acts. Colonists called them the Intolerable Acts because they weren't able to take it. They were intolerable. Well, in 1775, the American Revolutionary War began, and the Second Continental Congress decided to set up their own army, called the Continental Army. They selected George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army. It made sense. He not only had a lot of experience as a general in the French and Indian War, but he also wanted the American colonies to be independent and free from Great Britain. George Washington accepted the position, but he refused to get paid to serve as commander of the Continental Army. That's right, he wanted to volunteer and serve without any cost to the American colonies. What a nice guy. So he got to work. George Washington trained and prepared the Continental Army for battle. He wanted to make sure they were ready and helped them become a better, stronger army. And here was his job, if you will. George Washington helped come up with battle plans, led the Continental Army in many battles, and helped the Continental Army run like a well-organized unit. And he was a great commander. Part of what made him a great commander was he was not afraid to take risks. For example, in one of the most famous moments in the Revolutionary War, George Washington led troops across the Delaware River to do a surprise attack on December 25th in 1776. That was Christmas night! Oh my goodness! Even though the water was icy and dangerous, George Washington knew it would be a great surprise attack. Everyone was like, George, too much ice, man! But they pressed on, and it was a big victory for the Continental Army. George Washington eventually led the Continental Army to victory. With help from the French, the Americans defeated the British. After winning the Revolutionary War, the American colonies began setting up their brand new government. And really to no one's surprise, George Washington was picked to lead the Constitutional Convention that established order in the new government. And of course, because he was presiding over everything, George Washington signed the Constitution. Then, when it came time to elect officials, the American people decided there was no better man to serve as the very first president of the United States than George Washington himself. He was elected president in the first national election. In 1789, after he was sworn in as President of the United States, he went to live in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the temporary capital of the United States. This is a picture of the house he lived in while he was president. Now, of course, this was before the White House was built. This is the house in Philadelphia that George Washington lived in. Before we keep talking about George Washington as president, we have a random fun fact about George Washington for you. Did you know that George Washington didn't wear a wig? That's right, that was always his own hair. He grew it long and would just pull it back. The reason his hair always looked white was because he powdered his hair. He must have thought it looked awesome. So if anyone ever asks you for a cool random fact, let them know that George Washington didn't wear a wig. Guess he didn't need one. It's shocking, isn't it, Mr. Whiskers? It's just crazy. He didn't wear a wig. He didn't wear a wig. All right. Well, back to George Washington as president. As we mentioned earlier, he was living in Philadelphia, which was the temporary capital of the United States, which is interesting. And as you might imagine, as neat as being the first president sounds, it was really difficult and challenging. There were many issues that needed fixing, being a brand new nation and all. But George Washington worked hard to give the United States a strong start. In the second national election, George Washington was elected president for the second time. He refused to run a third time and started the tradition by most presidents of serving no more than 2 terms. Can you spot President George Washington in this picture? Yeah, he's right there, yep, Not only did George Washington help the American colonies win their independence and become a new nation, but George Washington also served as the first president of the United States. That is why George Washington is often called the father of his country. Sadly, George Washington wasn't able to see much of what America would become. He became sick and died in 1799 at Mount Vernon. George Washington made a huge impact, and he is celebrated and honored all around us. The capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., was named after George Washington. The Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. was built to honor the memory of George Washington, the father of the United States. We see George Washington honored on our money, like the dollar bill. Dollar bills are super cool, and George Washington is on all of them. He is also on the quarter. George Washington is on the front of every single quarter, even the state quarters. And of course, George Washington is on Mount Rushmore. It's the amazing sculpture that was carved right into the granite of a mountain in South Dakota. Wow, he is featured on many other sculptures, but this is the biggest and most famous. What a life George Washington lived. Here are just a couple of his accomplishments. He was a general in the French and Indian War. He was the commander of the Continental Army, and he was the first president of the United States.